just to start off, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Candice Schermerhorn. I'm a research specialist with RPI, which is Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute based in Troy, New York. I'm also, with that, involved with the Jefferson Project at Lake George. The Jefferson Project is more of a collaborative program where we work on monitoring water quality, typically mostly on Lake George in the Adirondack region of New York, though we have been moving to other lakes. So I kind of have a mix of doing research at the university mixed with going out on the lake and sampling anything from fish to zooplankton to just monitoring things like water temperature. So my job is very, I don't know what the best word for it, but collaborative, and there's a variety of things I do. I also work as my role is really as a research specialist. It's more of like a fancy word for a lab technician. So I do a lot of stuff ranging from cleaning the lab, making sure our equipment's all ready for the field season. With COVID, I've gone more in towards the research side of things, writing papers and all that kind of fun stuff. So there's a lot of things I do here, but it makes it fun.
Mm-hmm. You know, that makes sense. And just because I don't know if everyone knows what like a lab technician is. So do you want to say in just like a little brief what that is?
As a lab tech, I do anything from making sure the lab is working properly, helping. We have some postdoctoral researchers. Wow, I can't speak today. Researchers that we work with, as well as some graduate students. So I'll help them if they're running experiments. Sometimes have the opportunity to run my own experiments. We do a lot of. We go out on the lake, on Lake George, a lot and sample. So I'll go out and drive boats and take water samples. Then after, that's the fun part that we get to do during the summertime. And then of course, we have to analyze those samples. So I'll bring them back to the lab. Most of my winters are spent sitting in front of a microscope, IDing anything from the zooplankton, phytoplankton, macroinvertebrates. So there's a variety of things kind of to help keep the lab running that I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you were going to sort of share some of the things that you've learned from the research, what would you think is something you want everyone to know about?
So our lab focuses a lot on anthropogenic or human stressors on the environment. So a lot of the work we've done focuses on things like road salt runoff, or pesticides, or how invasive species affect the ecosystem, and in turn people. So I think things like that are important. I don't know how much you want me to go into it.
Well, why don't you pick one? So one of the anthropogenic stressors. Did I pronounce that right? Anthropogenic or anthropomorphic? No, anthropogenic.
It's a fancy way for saying how humans affect the environment, mostly negatively.
So what one anthropogenic stressor that you think is sort of like important for people to know about?
Yeah. So I guess I'll talk about road salt because I'm currently writing a paper about it, so it's a lot on my mind. So we did an experiment where we tested. We had bags in the lake, and we would put different levels of salt into them to see how it would affect the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, which are the small creatures that live in the water that fish and other organisms eat. And what we found was that adding road salt decreases the amount of zooplankton and phytoplankton that are in the water, and in turn that could have cascading effects on the environment. Of course, if we don't have zooplankton, then the fish don't have anything to eat. And we've also found, my lab has done a lot of work with road salt, so I'm nowhere near the level of profession that a lot of them are, but they've also found that it can disrupt things like circadian rhythms in zooplankton, which is basically how an animal tells when it's day or night. And zooplankton move up and down in the water column to avoid predators or to eat food. So that's a big factor. Salt can affect all different kinds of things in the environment, which is something that we didn't really think of when we started putting road salt on the roads back in the 70s. And what they found is a lot of freshwater bodies around the area and in the world have about, I think it's 20% more salt than their original concentration of salt is. So we're kind of just starting to get into it, and the scientific community as a whole, and figure out, wow, what is the salt doing, and how is it going to affect the ecosystem, and in the future, what's going to happen with this.
Wow. So that's actually,
go ahead.
I think that's actually really interesting because, when I think about salt in the environment, I mean, I know that too much salt can be bad for a person, obviously. Like, we need some. If we have none, we die. If we have too much, we die. We need a medium amount, like so many other things, right?
Yeah.
And then, but it is like a very much a natural substance. It's not some sort of thing that the environment has never encountered before. It's always there in some level. So it seems like it might be less of a problem, but it sounds like it might actually be, when we change the amount, it could have some really unexpected side effects.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Is this a sort of thing where you feel like people should be taking action, or like we don't know enough to know yet, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Just as an example, in Lake George, we have found that the road salt has increased, I think 15 or 20% in the water than it was, say, 50 years ago. So something that they did was the community got together and talked with the town, and they implemented, they have a lot of money up there, as you could probably tell, because it's a beautiful lake. And they talked to the town, and they implemented a way to have new plow systems where they actually have a live edge plow, and it kind of reads the road to tell how much ice is on the road, how much they really need to be putting down, and it change depending on the surface. And that's an expensive way to kind of mitigate this. Another thing is, people have been doing a lot of research and finding that you can use alternatives to salt that aren't as harmful to the environment. Things like the byproduct of when people make cheese, like cheese brine, and they'll put that on the road rather than road salt, and it's a more natural thing. Or things like beet juice also works, or honestly just reducing the amount of road salt that we need to put on the roads. With climate change and all of those factors, we're finding that a lot, that it's snowing a lot and we're having more larger snow events. So we've been using a lot more salt in recent years. So I definitely think that's something that communities should know about and talk about, because research has found that it's definitely affecting the environment, and any way we could reduce it would be great.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Now you said something that's really interesting, and I think people might have little question marks over their heads right now, which is, with climate change, you're getting more snow events. Do you know anything about that, or do you feel like that's a little bit out of your area of comfort to talk about?
It's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but we have been, if you hear in the news, I mean, we see it all the time. People think climate change, they think global warming, but that's not always the case. A lot of projections will say that actually in the Northeast where we are, I know you're talking to people that are down south more as well, but there's snow events there. We're finding that there's a higher frequency of snow events, and also they're larger snow events. So climate change will affect everywhere differently, and it's kind of up to us to really figure out what's going to happen, and obviously hopefully prevent it from happening. But
yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. And I thought it was really interesting also talking about different things that could be sprayed, because of course people put salt on roads to save life, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's important. It's something we have to do. We can't just stop. Though there are, I know other states will use sand instead of salt. There are different alternatives, and there are salt alternatives that use partly salt and then other chemicals. So it's all about kind of trying to find a balance, like you said in the beginning, between saving lives and being safe, and also making sure we're protecting our environment. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that students are going to be doing with this project is coming up with ways that they can make the world a better place. So either stewardship projects or civic action. And it sounds like there might be a really great opportunity for civic action around sort of sensible salt use.
Yeah.
And like, instead of just dumping the most salt, but like... Really...
Yeah, and even if it doesn't go to the level of talking with your community and trying to get them to use alternatives to salt, you could even, people in their driveways could read a bag, and students could go out and just talk to community members and say, hey, like, just be mindful about the kind of salt you're using and how much you're putting down, because this, of course, will eventually go into your watershed. And we can even see on the side of the roads that have a lot of salt usage, it kills the roadside plants. So it's something that you can really see, and it's tangible, but it's a lot harder to see it in the water because it's dissolved in the water, and it's hard to track these kind of things. But
yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that. The idea that you may or may not, who knows, be able to influence what happens in your town, but you could probably talk to your neighbors and be like, exactly. Hey, I have an idea. And it's not going to be too hard, but it could help. So I love that. Thank you.
I was trying to, when I was, before I started, after you sent me that email, I was kind of just trying to brainstorm some different ideas that might interest students. I don't know if you guys do this kind of thing, but we do a lot of Watercraft steward initiatives where you'll have I need to like rethink my thoughts. When I know I'm being recorded, I feel like it makes me nervous for some reason, but it shouldn't. So Watercraft stewards, they'll go to a water body and sit at a boat launch, and they'll sit there, and as people are coming in and out of the boat launch, they'll talk to them about invasive species, ask them if they're aware of them, ask if they clean their boat between water bodies and that kind of thing. I don't know if that's something that happens around like anywhere else besides New York State, because I've only ever lived in New York State, but I thought that might be a good thing to even just discuss. It could be as easy as putting up signs at boat launches and saying, be aware of invasive species, make sure you clean your watercraft before you move between lake bodies, that kind of thing.
I am wondering, actually, could you talk about like why that's important? Like why would you need to clean a boat?
Yeah, so invasive species can be a problem if they're a non-native species that you're spreading from a place that it's not originally from. So if you bring a species into a new environment, then it doesn't have any native competitors that would be able to keep that in check. So if you bring, say, a really common one that we talk about all the time is zebra mussels. Mm-hmm. And they originally came over on cargo ships in the St. Lawrence River, and now they're prevalent across all of New York State. So it's important to not spread these different species between places where they're not originally from, because it's very easy for them to go unchecked and take over an ecosystem without any native competitors. And things like zebra mussels filter the water. They're like they're a mollusk, so they just filter the water, and they do it very, very well. So that's taking away food from the native species, like fish that would also need to eat those things in the water. There's other invasive species like plants. Hydrilla is one that's been talked about a lot lately. So that's another. It's a plant, an invasive species that outcompetes native plants. And that's bad for the ecosystem, because not only for the plants, but for the fish and other organisms that rely on native plants for nursery habitat and that kind of thing. And also people don't like it because it gets stuck in their boats and it's just a nuisance. It doesn't look nice. No one wants to swim in a weedy lake. So it's just important that you're not spreading species that aren't supposed to be there to a new lake, because the ecosystem isn't adapted to that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. And I know something that people do, and it can be a lot of fun, is to do like an invasive species removal day.
I was going to say that.
But then if you think about it, it would make a lot more sense to keep the invasive species out in the first place instead of like a few times every summer getting together and everybody pulling up a lot of, hydrilla or whatever the invasive species of the day is.
I was gonna also mention that as a cool community project that I always like doing. We would do water chestnut pulls, and everyone gets a kayak out, and you go out there and you spend a day pulling the invasive species. But as you were saying, it's a lot better to prevent that from even happening in the first place. Mm-hmm. And without people even knowing this, then there's no chance, So
right. Yeah, I'm wondering, so when you go to a lake, because you do mostly work on a lake as opposed to like a stream or a wetland, but when you go to a lake and you're looking around, what are some of the things that you like to keep an eye out for and notice?
Well, I worked as a watercraft steward when I was in undergrad, so I'm always looking for invasive species, and so I'll be looking to make sure I'm not seeing a species that looks different. What else am I looking for? I like to see, I'll look around a lake and see what the watershed looks like. What kind of, do the people have beautiful manicured green lawns? That makes me a little bit nervous that there's probably a lot of new nitrogen and phosphorus going into the water body. If it's a more natural looking surrounding of the water rather than there being like large cement walls or something. That's I guess that's kind of more what I'm looking for as far as what's surrounding the lake. But
so you were saying that green lawn, when you see it, it can make you nervous. Could you sort of explain why that would be?
Yeah. So a lot of the times when you see a green lawn, you think that might be a natural thing, but really, if you just let your lawn grow, then there would be other plants, weeds, things that we call weeds that we don't think of as being as attractive. But those are really the natural things that grow on that lawn, that would grow on that lawn if we didn't plant grass seed. But when you see a very green lawn, it looks healthy, but really to make that lawn that green, you have to add a lot of different nutrients to it, like nitrogen and phosphorus. And in turn, those nutrients will eventually make it the way into your watershed and into a lake, and that will add more nutrients to the lake, which isn't always a good thing. While we need nutrients to survive, too many nutrients can also be a bad thing. So adding more nutrients can make some species grow much faster than other species, and then not give the other species a competing advantage and kind of mess with the whole balance of the ecosystem.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It seems to me like a recurring theme, because I've been talking to a bunch of scientists, a recurring theme is that even if something is good in a small amount, if there's a large amount, it could cause a real problem.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of just a universal thing that we think of all the time, like with our bodies. Like you were saying before, too much salt can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing, but you need salt to survive. So really, as an ecologist, you always have to think that it's all about balance and kind of seeing, you don't want to tip the scales too far one way or the other, because you don't know what the effects will be 10 years down the road or even immediately. So we really have to be careful with how we manage our resources.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So because you work in a lake mostly, I was wondering, how do you know of any ways, or like, I don't even know how to ask this question, but do you notice if there's changes in what happens to the streams that feed into the lake?
Yeah, so with the Jefferson project that I work for, we actually have gauges on all of the streams or tributaries that enter Lake George, and we monitor things like how much, like the water flow, how much flow is going into the water, the kind of nutrients, temperature. These all are going to affect not only the things in the stream, but eventually the things in the lake. So we'll watch how things happen if we have a big storm event. We'll see how much flow is going into the lake, what is that bringing with it, and that kind of stuff. And without monitoring the lake is great, but without monitoring the things that are being brought into the lake, then we really can't track how things change over time and be able to protect it in the future. That
makes sense. You mentioned that you're tracking how the things change over time. How is the lake doing?
Lake George is doing very well, actually, but there are things that they've been monitoring it way before my time. I believe they just published a study that they've been monitoring for about 40 years, and they have seen things change, such as salt or chloride amounts in the lake. A lot of other things that people like to think of when they think of lakes is how clear a lake is, and they think that a clear lake is a nicer lake or a better lake. So we'll monitor things like water transparency, and we use this big disc that has black and white on it, and you lower that into the water, and then that can tell you how far. It's basically how far down into the water you can see, and things like that over the last 50 years may or may not be changing in Lake George, but in other lakes that I've also worked on Chautauqua Lake, which is out in western New York, and they're having a lot of really, really difficult time dealing with harmful algal blooms in their lake. And I've actually been working on collecting, because we just started working at this lake, we kind of wanted to know what was the baseline of the lake and what was it like 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Has this always been a problem with harmful algal blooms? So I've been collecting as much data as I can, reading really old articles from like the 1900s, which has been really fun. And from what I'm finding is that the water quality has decreased over time at that location. Another big issue that people don't like about on that lake is that there's a lot of plants. People don't like swimming in the plants. And there's been talks that maybe the plants have not always been there. They've done a lot of herbicide treatment on the lake. But from what I'm finding, just in historical accounts and people talking, is that the plants have always been there. And now they're having issues with different things where they're adding herbicides to the lake and this kind of thing, and it may maybe not be the best thing for the lake. So it's really important. As we started this project, we kind of wanted to know what the baseline was and how's the lake changed. So that's kind of what I've been digging into. And as you said, it's really important. You don't want to just start going and monitoring something without knowing what its past was.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think you've answered all the questions I had for you, but except really for one, which is like, is there anything else you want people to know about? Is there something that you're like, this is really important? I just want to make sure people are aware of this.
So as I said before, we focus a lot on human stressors, invasive species, nutrients, pesticides, road runoff, that kind of thing. But just in my personal life and loving water and loving being next to the water, there's a lot of other things that we as humans can do to prevent our water bodies from declining. I always look out for invasive species. I make sure I'm not using things like harmful chemicals in my home or on my body. Like I try not to use things like DEET spray and then jump into a water body, because I know that might affect the animals in that water body. I'm trying to think of other things. I wrote down a bunch of stuff and now it's not coming to me, but that's always the way it is. If I think of anything else, I will definitely email you.
That sounds good. But that does make sense. Like, just if you're going to a lake just to have fun and enjoy it, and you put a bunch of stuff on your body, which is meant to kill or disgust insects, and then you jump into the lake, all of the macroinvertebrates that live there might also be harmed.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a lot of sense. And that seems like something that people can really also, take some action and maybe educate other people about.
Absolutely.
What do you do to avoid ticks if you don't use DEET?
So I always wear socks when I'm walking in the woods, even if it looks dorky. I have the long socks on. I always check for ticks. I actually got Lyme disease last year, which is not great, but there are other alternatives to DEET, and DEET is okay to use in small amounts. Just don't overdo it. There's also things like sunscreen that can affect the water and organisms in the water. So maybe try and use a more natural sunscreen or something like that. I think like the topic of this conversation is everything in moderation, and just to kind of be mindful of what you're doing and how it might affect the things around you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know for myself, and I am not the expert here, so who cares about what I do? But for myself, I read about sunscreen being really poisonous to coral. And I thought, that's a little bit alarming. So I've started wearing hats a lot more in the summer, so I don't have to use as much sunscreen.
Exactly.
Because I know hats aren't going to poison anyone.
Right. And I've been to beaches before where you kind of can just see a film over the water with people jumping into the water, and you just see this film of sunscreen floating on the water. And I'm like, I never would have thought of that. But then you see it in person, you're like, wow, this is definitely affecting our ecosystem.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. Like maybe personal choices might have more impact than we realize sometimes.
Right. And even if just one person does it, but if you talk to your friends about it and kind of spread the word, then that's how anything happens. It starts with one person. So
that makes a lot of sense. So I want to thank you so much for doing this interview.
Of course.
I think it's been really, really interesting and very informative.